Have you ever just finished a really good manga and thought to yourself, this really isn't how I pictured it? I can't help but feel like endings in manga are really bittersweet. They wrap up years of stories, character arcs, and expectations, and yet they often end up being divisive, but why is this? With recent shonen manga, there's a lot to talk about with two huge series coming to an end recently, that being My Hero Academia and Jujutsu Kaisen. Today, let's talk about why these two incredibly popular series sparked such mixed reactions and what this says about manga endings in general. When we take a high-level glance at JJK and MHA, we need to ask ourselves whether the reception of their endings is purely isolated to these two shows, and I'd argue that it isn't. Looking back on series like Naruto and Bleach, there was a ton of negativity, backlash, and mixed reception as these really popular stories were wrapping up. But now that another generation of shonen manga is ending, fans love to look back on these two series with rose-colored glasses and talk about how good the anime of the past was. And don't get me wrong, these two stories are absolutely incredible, but when Naruto and Bleach were in their final stages, people complained that storylines felt rushed, characters didn't get fleshed out as properly as they should have, and the mangaka, being Kubo and Kishimoto respectively, seemed to have forgotten about key characters who were integral parts of the story. And part of these are criticisms that are shared by Jujutsu Kaisen and MHA as well. In Naruto, the main problem that everyone had with the story was the fact that no big characters died, feeling like the emotional stakes were too shallow, and how Kishimoto completely botched it with the main villain Madara being taken over by Kaguya. And for Bleach, while the last arc is fun and entertaining, fans criticized that the pacing felt all over the place and the characters weren't given the true wrap-up that they deserved. Which is understandable given the time constraints Jump was demanding of Kubo at the time. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that there's a constant repetitive cycle that I'm seeing appear time and time again, just with different series. And I think there are two main root causes for this. The first reason that fans complain about an ending has to do with how long the series has actually been out. Let me explain. When you take a look at any long-running shonen manga like My Hero and Jujutsu Kaisen, they both cross over the 250 chapter mark, which, when you think of the timeline of released chapters, is over 5 years of a consistent release schedule. And first off, that's not an easy thing to do. So let's think about this 5-year timeline. If we were to jump into the shoes of our favorite mangaka, think about what they would have to consider for their series 3, 4, 5 years down the road from the start of their story. Ichiro Oda is famous for saying that he only planned One Piece to be a series that ran for 5 years, and now 27 years later it has developed a plot that he had no intention of ever creating. So the simple fact of not knowing how long your story will be highlights the importance of having a lot of critical details fleshed out before you sit down to write it, which is definitely easier said than done. What will your beginning, middle, and end look like? How will your characters resolve key plot points? What are the hanging plot threads that were mentioned in the beginning or middle that were never addressed in the end? And one that I think kind of flies under the radar is the question of how you're able to manage your fan base's expectations of the characters you're building. For a direct example on a story that I think does this well, let's look no further than Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, one of my favorite anime and manga ever created. Without delving into too many spoilers, for those of you who haven't watched or read it, it's a story that ties things together incredibly well on top of providing a sweet, overarching message and theme to the story in its closing chapters. Most of the characters we're introduced to get an established ending, whether that be sad, happy, or a mixture of the two. But it really felt as if everyone we met across the 108 chapters were fully resolved in some capacity. However, on the other side of things, I personally don't think it's fair to compare JJK, a series with 3 times the content as Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. It truly is a monstrous task to keep an audience engaged in a series for a long amount of time while keeping the core content relatively the same. In my opinion, at some point, the manga is either going to run out of steam momentum-wise or have to change the vibe and pacing to keep people interested. And when thinking about manga that do this really well, I immediately thought of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I mean, this concept is quite literally one of the main selling points of the series. So much so you could literally start a war in the comments section by saying that a specific part is better than another, and that's also the beauty behind it. People love different JoJo's parts because they have different tastes, and that's just ingenious to me. The first chapter debuted in 1987 and has been serialized in Shonen Jump and Ultra Jump since that time. And what JoJo's does so well is constantly keeping the audience on their heels when it comes to every part's themes, characters, and storytelling. With each new part, we get the treat of experiencing fun new protagonists, unique and interesting genres, entertaining stand abilities, and intriguing locations. Then once the point in time comes when we're ready for a change, the part ends and we're thrust back into a new, unique world. One that retains similar mechanics and memorable characters to start a new journey all over again with a different JoJo. Through its really unique narrative structure in constantly changing the environment, it indirectly works around its own longevity problem. And its relevance today is indicative that it's working. But for stories that don't share this structure, I feel like it's much easier to plan for the ending when they have it all figured out from an early stage, since the manga has a great sense of direction for where the story is headed, which also ties itself nicely with the fanbase's expectations of how the series is going to wrap up. And I think that fanbase's expectations can be let down in two unique ways. The first is that they had an idea of how the story was going to end, and it unfortunately didn't turn out the way that they wanted it to. While the second is that they wish the story ended in a way that just wouldn't be plausible or make any sort of sense narratively. For an example on this discourse, let's look no further than a show like Attack on Titan. And I think looking back on the ending now, I would say it was generally well received by the audience, but I say that with a bit of hesitancy. However, I remember reading this week to week as the final chapters were coming out, and man, that was a pretty divisive community, let me tell you. The reason I think this is the case is because Eren starts out the story like some angsty Avenger character set to kill every single Titan, but that's not where he ends up. His story ends with him being written as this sympathetic antagonist who had gone soft, leading people closest to him to cry at his death, which I think really upset some of the fanbase. And this is because what had actually happened in the manga was completely different than what they perceived the ending to be in reality. It was a betrayal to the character that fans expected Eren to be, and that caused a lot of controversy. And I just want to comment and say that I don't want to sound oblivious to the fact that all the responsibility of reception is on the viewer, because I don't think that's true to any extent. As I've mentioned earlier in this video, the responsibility also falls on the writer to ensure they've planned everything out properly to resolve their story in a way that's logical, cohesive, and satisfying to their readers. But a lot of the time, especially in manga, this isn't easy. Given the strict demands of weekly manga serialization, if your work isn't selling, they're going to want you out of that roster. This potentially means wrapping up your story prematurely, even if you don't necessarily want to. So I think when it comes to these large final arcs in manga, there is a ton of things that the writers have to juggle, and in my humble opinion, it seems nearly impossible to check every single box. But like we've discussed, everything primarily boils down to planning and expectations. And it's really interesting when you take a look at Jujutsu Kaisen and My Hero, because they each embody one of these areas that we've been talking about. My Hero fell flat due to simply not meeting the expectations of the viewers. From a content perspective, Horikoshi had put everything into the story that he wanted to, and I had personally felt as though narratively, everything fell into place nicely. However, I don't think that the viewers were prepared for the story to end the way it did, with Deku sacrificing his quirk to defeat Shigaraki and end the series quirkless. This was a huge subversion of expectations, since we constantly received a promise at the beginning of the story how Deku would become the greatest hero on the planet. And the ending theme of everyone can be a hero just seemed really corny to me. While on the other hand, Jujutsu Kaisen suffered from planning a good ending. I thought in some regards the wrap up for characters like Gojo, Yuji, and Sukuna were nice to see, but the rest just fell very flat. And on top of this, Akutami chose to emphasize a lot of these subplots that had no impact on the story that we cared about. To add insult to injury, many of the things that the viewers were actually interested and invested in went absolutely nowhere. What's the deal with the corruption in Jujutsu Society? What about the Culling Game merger that was hyped up for us to see, and then Kenjaku gets taken out in an anticlimactic way by Yuta? What about seeing more of Yuji's backstory? What's the deal with Nobara returning with literally 5 chapters remaining? And most importantly, what about Miwa? I know you guys are all interested in what happened to the GOAT, be honest with yourself. JJK felt like a story that Akutami was constantly expanding and had many well thought out ideas for. He just for whatever reason needed to wrap it up quickly, which is a big shame. And again, please don't get me wrong, I really love both of these works a lot, and both Horikoshi and Akutami did some incredible things in creating these series that we'll remember for a long time. But looking deeper at the endings of these manga reinforces just how much planning, foresight, and execution goes into finishing long-running works like these. But that's just my 2 cents on the ending of shonen manga and these two specifically as a whole. Do you agree with the criticisms of these endings, or do you think they were justified? Let me know in the comments. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe to let me know that this is exactly what you guys are interested in seeing. With that, I'll chat with you all in the next one. Stay curious, anime fam. Peace.